All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I'm Rick Urrutia here with my co-host Brian Pfeiffer. In this episode, we look back on what has happened in labor in the last year or so, highlighting some of the struggles we've reported on, people we've interviewed, and labor topics we've explored. We also bring you just a little bit of news towards the end of the show because there's some new and interesting stuff happening in places like Hollywood and Oakland right now. But before we get into all of that, we wanted to serve up a little bit of music. Here's Abby Lincoln and Max Roach performing Freedom Day. I thought this was a good vibe for a show that's reporting on International Workers Day, so enjoy.
Whisper, listen, whisper, say we're free. Rumors flying, must be lying, can it really be? Can't conceive it, can't believe it, but that's what they say. Slave no longer, this is Freedom Day. Freedom Day, it's Freedom Day. Throw those shackling chains away. Everybody that I see says it's really true, we're free.
All right, welcome back and happy International Workers Day. Although it is May 2nd, still vibing off of everything that happened on May 1st, all the celebrations, the protests and strikes here in the US and around the world. We wanted to take this episode as a recap of everything that's happened since last May Day and just take inventory, put some stuff in the history books for the working class, from the perspective of the working class, of all the cool stuff that's been happening and the cool stuff that we've been lucky to report on. So, Brian, one of the things that I pride our podcast on, honestly, is how we don't just focus on the US. Man, I love that this podcast allows us to cover workers around the world. In the last year, we've covered Germany, France, England, a great deal because there's been a lot of activity there, but we've also covered stuff in Nigeria, Canada, South Korea, and I hope we have a lot more stuff, coming down the pike as far as international coverage.
Hey, Rick, why, in your view, why are we focused on the international news from living here in the U.S. and having an internationalist perspective for our listeners who this might be their first show or just coming to hear us for the first time? From your perspective, why is it so important to have internationalism imbued in the show?
Well, the labor movement is international. Anything that you have in front of you right now, for instance, like this computer that's sitting in front of me right now, the table that it's sitting on, the chair that I'm sitting on, all of these things around us, the walls at my house, the ceiling, the house itself, the street, all of these things have the labor of workers around the world contained in it. Our work is interconnected with that of workers around the world. This was part of the process as capitalism globalized itself around the world. It created the international working class. So if we're going to struggle against capital, if we're going to struggle against the exploitations of capitalism, we have to understand that and connect the dots for ourselves. As far as tactics, as far as protests and strikes and stuff like that, but also just connect the dots so we understand how this system works And if we're really gonna build a new world out of the shell of the old, it's helpful to know how we get our food. It's helpful to know how we get our fuel, how we get, you know, how we produce in life, or where capitalism has brought us to. So that's why, we put so much emphasis on this. And that's part of what International Workers' Day teaches us, right? Is to connect those dots and, root for each other. I think that's part of what I love about International Workers' Day is that it encourages us to do away with those borders that capitalists so desperately want us to believe in and so desperately want us to see and so desperately want us to die for. International Workers Day says no, all our work is interconnected and we have a common exploiter. And so our struggles should be together. Our struggles should be in solidarity. So yeah, that's why, at least in my view, as I see it, and to me, that's a beautiful thing. A day that reminds you that your labor is interconnected and that you should extend solidarity. That to me is a very beautiful, honestly, spiritual thing. Like the day where we have to concern ourselves with the well-being of one another, with the justice of one another, with the liberation of one another.
Right on.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have some list here, and every one of our speakers, to one extent or another, or folks we've interviewed or topics we've raised, but especially the folks we've interviewed, from uh, Clarence Thomas to all. Maybe you want to go into the list you made, but David Soul, Ed Childs,
Yeah, no, that's
Irish leaders, Southern Workers Assembly, Black workers, African workers, transportation workers who work internationally. So it's a great list. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
no, yeah, that's what the list is there for to pick at. But yeah, these were some of my favorite interviews and some of my favorite themes during the last year. And Clarence Thomas is up there for sure. Clarence Thomas came on our show. If you're gonna pick an episode to listen to, I highly recommend that one. And he just schooled us on how the old school stuff still works and how, yeah, you can shut the ports down. He's a longshore worker, well, retired longshore worker now, but yeah, how you can shut the ports down in solidarity with the people of Iraq, with Mumia Abu Jamal, with the Palestinian struggle, with against apartheid in South Africa. So Clarence Thomas came in here with some serious lessons for us. And Brian, the Vermont AFL-CIO.
Mhm. Anti-fascist resolutions, support of LGBTQ and women rights, refusing to have racist in their union. All of this is in their program. It's quite something.
Inspiring. Yeah, no, if there's other AFL CIOs out there doing this sort of thing, I don't know about it, but definitely wanted to get them in the history books. That's exciting. That's where things need to go right now. As they pointed out, they have anti-communist language in their bylaws and their club. Why, man? It's like the fascists are the threat here.
Mhm.
So yeah, that was another favorite episode. This podcast has allowed us to talk about union democracy and social movement unionism, the importance of union democracy, which there's so many reasons, but I guess one of the first that comes to mind for me is because we want our unions to be microcosms of what a larger society could look like. So we want our unions to be the epitome of democracy, where everyone's voice is counted, is considered, So yeah, that's why we stress the union democracy here so much. Because when we create a better world, we want it to be for everyone, not just, the union officials, the union staff, or just even just the union members.
Yeah. Yeah, and like some of our historians, our heroes, like Howard Zinn and many others, we're looking at history to see what we can do today. And I think one of our highlights, at least for me, was the episode we did with the 1997 Teamsters, especially as the contract campaign is ramping up with the Teamsters at UPS. We've covered this many times, and Jerry was on that special show that we had in '97 on the Teamsters strike. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's another episode I love, of course, the 1997 Teamster strike. And again, my takeaway, I've said it a few times on the show, is that, the Teamsters accomplished more in 15 days of striking than most unions accomplish in 10 years of begging Democrats at the legislature or begging Democrats in Congress. They accomplished more in 15 days of striking. And to me, that was a particularly and well, looking back, because I only grew to understand the significance of the strike, while I was in my 30s, so well after the strike happened. But to me, one of the things that I most appreciate about the strike is that it instilled some hope again, after the PATCO strike, which for the benefit of some listeners, the PATCO strike was basically, or is thought of by many people in the labor movement as a point where labor really started to decline. And that's when air traffic controllers went on wildcat strike during the Reagan administration, and Reagan went ahead and fired all of them, and in turn completely dissolved the PATCO union. So labor needed a victory, and in 1997, the Teamster strike happened, and it happened within institutionalized labor, which is also interesting. Ron Carey, Teamsters for a Democratic Union, leading a charge for a more democratic union, for members to have a say, for members to be able to vote and discuss on what they were going to fight for and be able to speak to the media. That's one of the things that I love about some of the footage that's out there of the 1997 Teamster strike, is that some of the members are just being approached by the media, and they're happy to talk, because they know what they're talking about. They were in the meetings. It was a democratic process. There was discussion, it wasn't decisions made from above excluding the membership. This was institutionalized labor working in a very democratic fashion, for the benefit of its members, but also for the benefit of the working class, because they connected their struggle with the community. They connected their struggle with other people working and hurting from doing part-time work in the late 90s. So yeah, that was another very special episode for us. And I'm still inspired by the 1997 Teamster strike, and I hope to see I hope we see some semblance, coming up here with the negotiations that are taking place at UPS right now, right now. So hats off to that always, you know?
Yeah, and we have been seeing, as we've talked about many times on the show, the grad strike, striking grad students and other academic workers across the country. And there's many here: Rutgers, U of Michigan, Temple, Chicago State University, University of California, and other places.
Yep.
And right now, organizing is going on in Chicago, University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins, Yale, Northwestern. There's been a huge surge of graduate student union organizing in the Boston area with MIT and others, leading the way there. 5,000 graduate student workers at MIT organizing with the UE there, United Electrical Workers. Quite a year, quite a time since we started the podcast here, being in solidarity with all these grad student workers and being honored to report on their brave strikes and other direct actions that they're organizing.
Yeah, we also have on this list the United Auto Workers, Brian. And the interesting thing about the United Auto Workers right now is, I don't want to go on the record in saying this, but what I think I know is that the United Auto Workers is now at a point where they have more graduate student workers than actual auto workers, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
You're shaking your head in agreement. So yeah, these are exciting times, because those graduate student workers are doing things like striking and organizing and, bringing new ideas to the table. This isn't, excuse me, the old guard United Auto Workers that I'm seeing in these graduate student organizing and strikes. They're coming at things a little differently, more democracy in mind, more representation of more groups of people, more racial diversity, more gender, a better understanding of gender, or a different understand, an evolved understanding of gender, an inclusive understanding, if you will. So yeah, just they're bringing new stuff to the table, and it's exciting. It's necessary. It's long overdue. So yeah, the grad student workers are bringing some excitement along with Starbucks. I think we can also say that about Starbucks, and that's also on the list. They're rolling into the union movement with some fresh ideas, and again, it's long overdue. They concern themselves with the concerns of people of color, with the concerns of trans people, trans workers. So yeah, these are exciting times for the labor movement, and to me, they're like a breath of fresh air.
That's we interviewed the Jaeger from GEO Graduate Employee Organization Local 3550 in from Ann Arbor last week, and of course Rutgers brother out there of the Adjunct Faculty Union Vice President. And one of the things that I heard loud and clear from Jaeger was that they'd only been involved in the union, never even knew what a union was, and I come from a conservative family, and had only been really active for like 2 3 years, and especially active over the last year. And there was many tactics from strike kitchens to virtual picketing and all these tactics that might be older, might come from the 30s, or they might be brand new with the technology that we have today, but they've been extremely effective on these strikes. And by the way, Geo 3550 is still on strike, so if listeners can support them in any way, that'd be greatly appreciated. So their strike fund or whatever you can do, spread the word. It's great. And I think that goes into tandem. You have in your list here, Rick, about some of the folks we also talked to, such as Alejandro Lopez from the San Antonio Alliance of Teachers and School Personnel. They just won an over $20 million wage increases for 8,000 workers a couple weeks ago for the next year, 23, 24, and a whole variety of other wins that they've won that Alejandro talked about on the show. And this has come about because of the program that the executive committee and the membership passed. It's a fighting program for students at the core. Their slogan is fighting for the schools our students deserve. And that program is rooted in the community. It's rooted in students with the workers, all workers. It's a wall-to-wall local. And they're winning a whole variety of demands that they're putting forth. And this is in tandem with their leadership that knows that they have to fight every day, be in the work sites every day and organize, be in the community, march in. There's 2 huge marches every year honoring great leaders like Cesar Chavez and Dr. King, and a variety of other activities that are taking place. And the alliance is always in the community. So folks are beginning to see that the local really does have the best interest of the community and identifying the union with the community. And that's why they're advancing and winning. And we're seeing this with the folks we interviewed from the Black Workers for Justice and United Electrical Workers in North Carolina. They actually just had a Southern Workers Assembly last weekend, which was a packed hall at the Teamsters there. And many tactics are being talked about. And as they discussed on our show, Rick, and our listeners, we really encourage listeners to really listen and dig deep into those shows, because part of what we're doing here is we're not just interviewing folks for the sake of interviewing. Rick and I, as listeners, are also organizers ourselves. We of course take sides. We're partisans in the class struggle. We support unions. This is a pro-union podcast, so one of the reasons why we're bringing these types of folks, great union fighters and leaders and community leaders on our show, is they're doing great work, and we want to hear from the tactics that they're using that are successful, so we can share them and build upon them and learn from them. And there is a lot of lessons to be had from North Carolina, and part of that is, today it's still illegal for collective bargaining in North Carolina, but they are making all kinds of advances in sectoral bargaining, in municipal governments and state governments. They're winning various different kinds of rights and wage increases because they're building power from the bottom up, rooted in their communities. And there's many different kinds of ways to do that. And by having an assembly type approach, that brings in the entire working class. It's not just the members in a given work site. So when you're attacked, when the boss thinks about attacking you, they got to think twice, because they're taking on the whole community instead of just a few workers potentially at a work site. Although that could be a fight too, of course. But when you back that up with the community and other union members and students, that's a whole different fight. So the Southern Workers Assembly has a lot to learn there from them. So there's a lot of other good stuff. There's a reason why we're talking about people from the South in this country, because Iowa, Wisconsin, A lot of the Midwestern states have passed Jim Crow laws such as right to work and Act 10 in Wisconsin. And these methods that great union fighters like Alejandro Lopez from the Alliance and other folks in Texas and throughout the South, like in North Carolina, are talking about need to be implemented in states like that because with the union situation such that it is and the laws that are on the books, of course we need to continue to fight for unions and collective bargaining, but we also need other methods and other kinds of tactics. So it was wonderful, wonderful talking to those folks
It,
on the podcast here.
it was wonderful talking to them. And you started by talking about, the bit with Jaeger a little bit, and GEO Local 3550 on strike. And I think one of the biggest lessons I learned from that episode and from speaking to Jaeger and speaking with Hank, and I highly recommend folks listen to that episode. But one of the biggest lessons that I learned is that you really have to watch what strikers do in order to survive sometimes, because I think that gives us an indication of the types of things that we can do after capitalism. The strike kitchens that are organized, the planned economics, the solidarity, the mutual aid. Those are all ingredients that we're going to need in a world after capitalism. So it's interesting, necessary, instructive, whatever you want to call it, to watch that sort of thing. And I was really thankful that conversation came into play. And along with, the strike kitchen, there was also arts and crafts, there was music. And yeah, I think we need to pay attention to things like that. I think those things are really important just because it tells us, what kind of world do we want to build? Because I think the planet can only take so much of this pharma bro, Elon Musk, CEO shareholder bullshit, man. The planet can't afford them. So yeah, we gotta think ahead, and we gotta take notes of stuff like that. So I really enjoyed um, that interview for that specific reason, amongst others.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So
Yeah. And then do you remember the UAW 180? Rick, if you recall that, we both were in Racine for a few days. We led up to that, a few things, and all the items you just mentioned, we incorporated. We lit that place up with our fellow workers there. The courageous workers were on strike for a long time. They held the line, both in Burlington, Iowa, and in Racine. And we used the podcast to help do what we could. There was a lot of folks, a lot of different unions, many different community organizations helping those workers. And we had a solidarity day last December, and we had music, we had food. We were in the union hall making signs and working with the workers every day in a strike solidarity school, having some music and videos and reading and sharing and being a part of the community. And then the day of, we had a car caravan down the middle of the city back to the plant at another rally. And about a month later, the workers voted on a contract and went back to work there at Case and Racine. That was a lot of lessons, which we're still thinking about.
yep.
Listeners, a lot to learn from that one. And we're definitely not going to stop at Racine. We're probably going to do that in the future somewhere, but that was quite something.
Yeah, that was, I'll never forget that. And that was something that was really instructive for us as well. That was the contract that was sandwiched in between John Deere and Caterpillar. These are companies that have union members and all work in the same industry. So they basically make trucks and tractors and heavy construction equipment and stuff like that. So, just part of what we're watching here is when contracts get negotiated at an industrial level, or have consequences for workers in an industry, perhaps better stated. Yeah, the struggle continues there as well. And you know what? As another little breath of fresh air, Brian, has been the Teamsters.
Yes.
So the Teamsters have new leadership. President Sean O'Brien. I think, was it before he became, like, shortly before he became president, or shortly after he became president, he was in Boston talking about a general strike. Something along
Yes.
Yeah, something along those lines. And, with this new leadership, we've seen an increase in strike activity, an increase in organizing. Sanitation workers in Memphis have been on strike. Cisco workers have been on strike. Coca-Cola in Philly is currently on strike right now. And this is all really interesting, because this is different from what happened in 1997, right? There's activity, but it's strike and organizing activity. Whereas in 1997, I think all the activity was happening, within the rank and file, having meetings, having discussion groups and stuff like that. So yeah, the way I'm taking these strikes and all this organizing activity is that they're just firing shots, man, letting UPS know, hey, we're not playing. These little strikes that are happening all over the place, this could be UPS as a whole. And what was it, like 350,000 UPS Teamsters now, or something like that, the number, something like that? Yeah, you don't want to play with that. I think we should keep our eye on this because, the UPS and the Teamsters, this is the largest contract. This is the largest contract with a private company, excuse me, in North America. And I think whatever's negotiated here, has either ramifications or significance for the rest of us in the working class.
Sure.
So, part of that excuse me, part of all of this, part of the kind of contract that they get depends on the fight that they put up. And the fight that they put up also is dependent on the solidarity from the community. So if there's any strike activity that you hear about by the Teamsters in your community, that affects your business or anything like that, right now is the time to extend some solidarity so UPS Teamsters get a fair contract and just honestly, man, make this whole thing a little less exploitive on them and hopefully the rest of us.
Yeah, Rick.
So
Yeah, the one of the lessons that the Teamsters new leadership has learned as well, or has been engaged in, but now they can implement it nationally because they have leadership such as O'Brien, as well as the history of the Teamsters. The most successful contracts came about because the members just didn't rely on a bargaining team in a room with the bosses, right? So one of the things that the Teamsters are doing very successfully across the country right now is there is contract campaign activities happening everywhere, from 5 in the morning, whatever time the Teamsters drivers go to load up. There's parking lot rallies, T-shirt days,
that's
button
right.
days. This is happening in parking lots in all kinds of different locations and spatial locations all across the country, leading up to the expiration of the contract on midnight, July 31st. So they started this months ago. They've upgraded their technology. They have apps on their phone where members can be in contact with organizers, community members, and build quickly. They're starting to look at flying squadron type things. For example, what that means, listeners, if you've never heard of that before, is if there's a strike picket set up someplace and they need reinforcements, today technology is great. You can just text somebody or use an app to do that, or call or have a phone tree. You can do all kinds of things, but just to have a system set up whereby a flying squadron can come over and bolster the picket lines. So you can send a text and say, we need 20 pickets over here to bolster this picket gate because we got a bunch of scabs coming over here trying to ram their way through the picket line. So flying squadron system would be that people are on standby 24/7 during a picket. Could be 3 in the morning and be boom. Let's get some folks over there. Let's bolster our friends, fellow workers on the line. So this kind of activity is building up. There's rallies happening across the country. O'Brien is speaking at various places, and this is all leading up to quite a summer, we believe, to be shaping up here with Starbucks and Teamsters and all these other actions going on. So if listeners, you can always find more information. There's rallies taking place and all kinds of contract campaign activities happening at the Teamsters Facebook page. So feel free to join a rally. They love community support, and they'd like to see fellow workers out there supporting them and bringing the messages back to communities as well.
So right on, man. So that was basically the recap for since the last International Workers Day here. Some of the stuff that we just wanted to really, put into the history books, into working class history for ourselves, give significance because, the bosses aren't going to do it. The capitalists aren't going to do it. Liberals, I don't know about them, but this is why we put it out there because this stuff is significant and this stuff gives us hope. And also because this stuff can build and become a bigger movement. A strike can become a strike wave. A strike wave can grow from there, in many different directions, towards a mass strike, towards a general strike, towards a labor uprising. So it's important to watch this stuff from the very beginning so we understand what's going on and where people are coming from. So we will continue to do that. And still in that spirit, we still have some current events for you today, because yesterday was International Workers Day. So we do have some stuff to report on. So Brian, take us off, man. Whoa, what's been going on with Workers Day around the world?
All right, May Day 2023. There was literally tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions or more, of our fellow workers on the streets rallying and all kinds of other events yesterday, May Day, and some today. In Wisconsin, there was a rally and a march sponsored by Voces de la Frontera, demanding driver's licenses for the undocumented, as well as many other demands. And today in Madison, there was also a similar action at the state capitol there in Madison. And there's photos, videos, and pictures at the Voces de la Frontera Facebook page, as well as the Milwaukee Teachers Education Association, which supported the actions. And there's a school lunch campaign whereby the students in the Milwaukee public schools do not have fresh fruit, vegetables, and food. A lot of the food is trucked in and it's not of good quality. So the students there, led by Voces de la Frontera Youth Group, is called Youth Empowered in the Struggle, or YES, is waging a campaign with a whole variety of community allies, including the Teachers Union, to demand that school lunches that are nutritious are brought back. And that's in Milwaukee and Madison today. And there's a whole partial listing of the actions across the U.S. at the Wisconsin Bailout People Movement Facebook page, including those ones just mentioned. Also, our friends with the World Federation of Trade Unions Facebook page has photos, video, and coverage. There has been actions, of course. They have France and India, all over the world, May Day actions. And there's too many to mention here on the podcast, but there was a whole variety of them. And it's going to be leading up to a long, hot summer struggle, we believe, here at We Rise Fighting. So a lot of great ideas, a lot of tactics, as we discussed. We're not just reading this information. We really are participants in it. And we are hoping that listeners are too. In our great socialist nation of Cuba, the traditional huge parades are off due to the fuel problem. And that is largely because of the murderous, outrageous U.S. economic blockade against Cuba. It hasn't been canceled, but the May Day rally, but it's been postponed until Friday. There's also been some harsh weather conditions and blackouts. So where possible this week, cultural events will be planned. And Monday, of course, is still a national holiday there in Cuba. Workers' Day, can you imagine that in the U.S., right? One day it will be when we win socialism here. So Cheryl Labash from the National Network on Cuba reports in that no one can cancel May Day, the International Workers' Day. And it's not canceled, as we mentioned. And the Guardian headline from England misrepresents what is happening on the ground. There are about 250 participants in brigades and delegations who are already celebrating the International Workers' Day with the Cuban people. So Cheryl Labash is on the ground there reporting from NNOC Twitter, so you can check out more information there, and also on Instagram. And due to the U.S. blockade of the fuel shortages, May Day will be celebrated in a more decentralized way, which we've mentioned. But they have gathered in the streets yesterday and today. It won't be in the plaza, but it is happening. Part of the big demand of May Day there, of course, is to end the savage U.S. blockade against Cuba, which is causing a horrendous amount of difficulties, fuel shortages, medical shortages, and it needs to stop. And the majority of the world is in support of ending the blockade, as we see at the United Nations every year. So a hearty May Day welcome and solidarity to everyone, and especially our friends in Cuba. And we're going to move on here to quite a May Day celebration with the Korean Federation of Trade Unions in Seoul. It was a massive rally of 130,000 KCTU members. That's the Korean Federation of Trade Unions, took to the streets in Seoul in 15 different provinces. Yang Ki-soo, president of the KCTU, suggested raising the minimum wage is a first step to tackling inequality and polarization. This is a quote from the union leader. Workers need to work fewer hours to get paid more to make their lives better. We can't protect our jobs by standing up to governments that want to privatize public services. To save people's lives, we need to strengthen healthcare and public pensions by taxing the rich and powerful, not by raising utility bills. He emphasized the importance of fundamental labor rights and function of trade unions, quote, wages and jobs, people's livelihoods and public space all cannot be defended without trade unions. Defending democratic unions is a struggle to defend our survival. We must bring the revision of Articles 2 and 3 of the Trade Union and Labor Relations Adjustment Act so that all workers can be united in the trade union movement. We need to ensure collective bargaining at industrial level and introduce extended application of collective bargaining agreements so that all workers can struggle together and win together. In the spirit of International Labor Day, let's fight together across gender, age, race, and nationality. Only struggle can save us against those who want to take away our rights, end quote. And that's the KCTU president. In the early morning of May Day, one of the offices of a local branch of the Korean Construction Workers Union set himself on fire in protest to the government's targeted prosecution and criminalization of union activity. He was accused of intimidation and threatening the employers by requesting collective bargaining on employment security. In total, 15 construction workers are now in jail under the same charges. But as we just heard, the KCTU is not backing down in South Korea, and they're going to continue to march forward. And we send our solidarity to them and a hearty May Day. And now, Rick, we're going to go to France, Italy, and the Netherlands.
Yeah, this is an article from Al Jazeera just listing some of the places where big strikes or protests took place on International Workers' Day. We've been reporting on the strikes and the protests that have been taking place in France for several weeks now. And if you're just tuning in for the first time, those protests in France, in England, in Germany, those strikes have been massive, especially in France and especially in England, sometimes involving, hundreds of thousands of workers. So May Day was no exception. Saw some protests in France, Italy, and the Netherlands. Always a lesson for us here in the United States. Some people like to point to French workers and British workers and workers in Europe as, having better health systems or vacation systems or pay or retirement or stuff like that. And this is how it happens. This is how it happens. It doesn't happen from going and begging their version of Democrats. It happens through strikes on the streets, through popular resistance, through struggle. So, yeah, happy to be reporting on that. And also a couple of other tidbits of news that we're going to hopefully cover in the coming weeks. Rutgers has apparently reached a tentative agreement. Brian, you had sent me that article, and I just wanted to mention that. I did catch that they have some highlights of the tentative agreement and some of the language on the website, and that's the website of the AAUP union, which represents Rutgers part-time faculty. So if you're curious and want to see what's going on, I can guide you that far. Also, there's a Hollywood strike that just kicked off, I guess, let's see, not even 20 hours ago now. And that would be the Writers Guild of America calling the strike. We're going to continue that continue covering that in the weeks to come. Also in the news right now, Southwest pilots voted on a strike. So this doesn't mean that they're going to strike. This just means that they're giving their leadership authority to call a strike if and when needed. So we're also going to keep people informed as to what's going on with that. And finally, the last bit of news this week that we just want to offer a bullet point on is that Oakland Teachers Union may be set to strike this coming Thursday. So yeah, these little bullet points are stuff that we're going to continue covering, but just wanted to mention for this episode because that's what we do. We cover strikes. We give significance to worker actions because we get excited about them. They could lead to something. They can build. And we hope that with our tiny little podcast, we can help build that. We can help spread some consciousness and, carry out some workplace action that results in, some greater justice for the working class, some advances for our class. So that's been a year since last International Workers' Day. I love our podcast. This all started off just because, this is the kinds of conversations that we would have anyway. So we just added a little bit to it, gave it a little bit of structure, and turned it into this podcast. And we thank you for listening. We thank people for chiming in and just considering what's going on here. We hope we make it worthwhile for you, and we're very excited about future episodes that are coming down the pike. We're talking about exactly what we're going to do as far as strike activities, who we're going to interview, stuff like that. Brian is going to come visit me in Denver in June. We're going to hang out, talk about the direction of the podcast, and how we can continue bringing you some working class news. So with that, solidarity and love to all. Thank you again for listening, sincerely. And we hope to catch up with you again real soon. Have a good night, everyone.